I start with Chiara Bottici, who is from the New School in philosophy, colleague and working on myth. Thank you, Chiara.
Thank you very much. As we are at the end of a long day, indeed 2 long days, I thought I would begin with an anecdote. Here it goes. I started working on myth and politics in 2000, more or less, because I was interested in fascism. Coming from a family, an Italian family devastated by the fascist regime, one grandfather deported to a work camp, the other killed, it's all too easy to understand why. One day, after the publication of my book on the topic, my 10-year-old nephew asked me, "What did you write about?" I said, "You know, I'm interested in philosophy." But curious as he is, he kept on asking, "But you know, what kind of philosophy? What is exactly the topic?" So I showed him the book. I said, "It's called A Philosophy of Political Myth." And he looked at me and said, "Ah, you wrote about Berlusconi." So, for a whole day, I kept thinking that perhaps my little nephew got the point better than I did. I was not simply interested in philosophy. Perhaps I was not just trying to understand our fascist past. Perhaps I was trying to come to terms with the present, Berlusconi. If it is true that modern politics, as some have argued, has gone through a process of rationalization and bureaucratization, what is the place for myth within it? Has myth ever been overcome by modernity in one way or another? And what are we saying when we speak about the Western exit from myth? I first looked for an answer among political philosophers, particularly from the left, and I have to say that I did not find much that was of an help. The more I dig into the topic, the more I found myself in company of anthropologists, historians, literary theorists, sociologists, even political scientists. For all of them, it was pretty clear that, to paraphrase Clifford Geertz, myth has never gone out of politics, notwithstanding all the banal that has certainly entered into it. Yet, the question remained for me, why philosophers, and in particular, why leftist political philosophers are reluctant to focus on myth as the primary focus of their enterprise? Why do they keep oscillating between the Scylla of rationalism with its normative standard of justice and the Charybdis of a political theology with its smell of death? Not only do political myths exist, but they also theorize about, but not by the people I wanted to be theorizing about it. Why is it so? Has the left all too easily left myth together with religion to the right? And what is the specific contribution that philosophy could bring to the understanding of the interplay between myth and politics? Now, in the book, I tackle the question through a genealogical approach that I cannot present here because it's too long of a story. For some of you may be familiar. It's a story that begins with the remark that in the most ancient Greek source, mythos, the word from which our myth derives, meant word. It was used as synonym of logos. So the two were used as one and the same thing. Subsequently, you look at what happened to me when the term logos became, in particular with the gospel, the word of God, and in particular the word of the monotheistic Christian God. And then, to cut a long story short, what happened when the logos took the form of the Western scientific rationality. Let's say I'm not going to rehearse the whole story. What I'm going to do, taking up Adolf invitation to conceive of concepts as performing something, I will just perform, so to speak, the final scene of the whole story. So I will begin by pointing to what seemed to me the weakness or the weaknesses of available theories of political myths, and trying to advance some suggestions as to the possible ways to overcome them. And after discussing the concept of myths in general, I will move on to political myths, and I will finally conclude with some brief remarks on the relationship between political myths and political theology. So to begin with, the work on myth. one of the first things that strike me about political science literature on the topic is that one very often encounters theories that look at myth from the standpoint of its claim to truth. For instance, Lincoln defines political myth as, quote, a narrative for which successful claims are made not only to the status of truth, but what is more, to the status of paradigmatic truth, end quote. Similarly, Flood defines political myth as, quote, an ideologically marked narrative which purports to give a true account of a set of past, present, or predicted political events, end quote. Is this a helpful way to look at political myth? Admitting, as I think we should do, that we perform with language a number of actions that are not aimed at advancing any claim to truth, should we not look at myth as primarily one of these other things that we do with language? Maybe myth in general, and political myth in particular, is not primarily an act of saying, but also and foremost an act of doing. So if social science and political science literature appear to me as often entrapped into a limited view of language, the problem with the philosophical theories, those that I found available, was that they treated political myths under categories that were too general. For instance, in the myth of the state, Cassirer considered political myth under the heading of what he calls the mythical consciousness, while more recently, in veil politics, Wingo looks at them through the notion of political veils. But conflating myth with other forms of political symbolism is both misleading and problematic. It's empirically misleading because it occurs the fact that myths are symbols, but not all symbols are myths or cast in mythical forms. And it's also problematic because one all too often risks ending up in a generalized refusal of all forms of mythical consciousness, often associated with some kind of primitivism, or what I think is an equally problematic defense of all forms of veils, as Wingo does. And I consider that the notion of veil that Wingo employs include everything that goes from myths, narratives, symbols, flags, rituals, national heroes, even religious heroes. More in general, it seemed to me that there is really something about this topic, political myth, that made it recalcitrant vis-a-vis a philosophical treatment. And perhaps it's not by chance that the classical theories of political myth are the result of a reflection on specific examples. This holds true, for instance, for Cassirer, the myth of the state, with its focus on the myth of the Aryan race, and for Sorel, Reflection on Violence, which focuses on the general strike. And the two books are perhaps the most important philosophical books on the topic. So they were meant to be my companion. Precisely because both Cassirer's and Sorel's theories remain too bound to their models, they do not really allow for generalization. Are political myths a means for domination, as Cassirer seems to argue by analyzing the myth of the Aryan race, or for liberation, as Sorel sustained for the proletarian general strike? Actually, the same political myth can be a source of both oppression and liberation, depending on the context. Sorel's myth of the class struggle and the myth of the proletarian general strike has not always been a means for liberation, for instance. This example points to what I think we can call the particularistic nature of political myth, to the fact that the same narrative can have very different outcomes depending on the particular circumstances in which it operates. Myth expresses itself through variance. Properly speaking, we never see a single myth at work, but always and only variants of it. And here lies its particularism, which is also, I believe, the source of its pluralism. And indeed, a narrative that works as a political myth for a certain group of people may not be so for another group of people. And even for the same group, a given narrative can work as a political myth in certain circumstances, but not in others. Now, a way to make sense of this particularistic nature of myth is to say that myth is a process. not an object given once for all. And indeed, a myth does not consist of a story that is told once for all. Take the myth of Ulysses. What is this myth outside of the many variants that we encounter of this myth? At times, even contrasting one. The one that sees him happily coming back home to Ithaca, along with the opposite one that sees him never coming back to Ithaca. A myth consists in the process of elaborating the possible variants of a story. And this is what Hans Blumenberg, a philosopher that I found particularly inspiring in this book, although it's not exactly on the left, tried to convey when he said that a myth consists in the Arbeiter mythos, that is, on the worker myth. By worker myth, Blumenberg means a process of elaboration of a narrative core that answers a need for significance. But this need for significance is constantly changing. And this is the reason why myth has to express itself through variants. In each single context, the same narrative pattern is reappropriated, what he calls Umbesetzung, by different needs and exigencies to which you must respond. So either a narrative core is really able to respond to these changing circumstances, or it ceases to be a myth and becomes a simple narrative that no longer has a grasp. Now, what is such a need for significance? The term significance denotes a space between a simple meaning and what we can call an ultimate meaning. Something can have a meaning and still remain completely indifferent to us, even though what is significant must also have a meaning in order to be named in the first place. The need for significance is not merely the need for a meaningful world. The world depicted by natural science, for instance, is a world that has a meaning, but it can still remain completely indifferent to us. Still, I have to say, it tends to remain rather indifferent to myself. At the same time, the need for significance is not necessarily the need for religion either, because something can be significant for a group without answering the ultimate question of life and death in the same way religion does. Precisely because of its ultimate and transcendent character, religions tend to produce a sacred history, whereas myth expresses itself through a plurality of stories. In particular, I think there is something in the idea of a monotheistic religion of the book that stands in sharp contrast with, for instance, the polytheism of the ancient Greek myth. To say, so it is written, amounts to a certain extent to saying you cannot imagine it otherwise, or even more, you will have no other gods besides me. The truth of the sacred book can certainly be interpreted, but not radically subverted. As a result, substantially differing versions of the sacred history are easily termed heresy. For example, the same sacred history cannot say that Jesus Christ resurrected while at the same time denying that he did. If it does, and indeed it did at times, it will generate another faith, and therefore another religion. By contrast, we can have the narrative of Ulysses returning safely to Ithaca to circulate together with the narrative that sees him swallowed up by the sea without there being any contradiction between the two. In sum, myth does not always provide a transcendent plan, a unique history that responds to the ultimate questions of life and death. When it does, we call it a religious myth, but it still has something to offer to human beings, and something that I think is qualitatively different from both religion and science. In my view, this need for significance is derived from the peculiar position of human beings within the world. By recovering a famous Nietzschean expression, Arnold Gehlen, another philosopher not exactly on the left, called human beings the always not yet determined animals. Human beings, in contrast to other animals, are not fully adapted to a specific environment and are therefore always not yet determined. Whereas most animals have a predetermined relationship with their environment, in the sense they are adapted to it, a fish would die outside of the water, human beings constantly change the environment they live in. And this puts them in a very peculiar relationship with their living conditions. And I highlight two consequences. First, this generates culture. As Bloom observed, when the pre-human creature was induced to avail itself of a bipedal posture and leave the protection of a hidden way of life in the rainforest, it exposed itself to the risk of a widened horizon of perception. As a result, the human creature was led to face what he calls the absolutism of reality, or the power of the unknown. Being exposed to an always potentially different environment, human beings are subject to a much higher number of stimulations from the outside world than other animals. And this puts on them a further burden from which they must seek relief, what he calls entlastung. Culture and language are the means, or at least the primary means, through which such a relief can be obtained. Second, perpetually changing environments also yields a problematizing relationship with our conditions of existence. Not only humans change their condition, but they can also raise questions about them. They get anxious about it most of the time. Therefore, human beings need meaning to master the unknown, to name it, to give it a name in the first place, but they also need significance to live in a world that is not indifferent to them. And this is what Blumenberg meant when he wrote that significance is a form of defense against the indifference of the world. Myth fights this indifference by placing events within a narrative plot. It typically addresses the question whence rather than the question why. As Karenyi noted, the function of myth is neither to provide a name for things nor to explain them in the way science does, but more specifically to ground them. And as he observed, German language provided the exact word for this function, begründen. Grund means both the English abstract noun reason and the very concrete noun ground. Myths tell stories, they describe the origin of things and simultaneously their trajectories, and it is in this way they provide canonical Grund. Now, if you look at myths from this point of view, three elements seems to be central: process, narrative, significance. Significance understood as different from myth. A myth is not a simple narrative. An organized series of events minimally suffice for something to be a narrative, but more is needed to have a myth. A myth is a narrative that responds to a need for significance that changes over time. Precisely because a myth has to provide significance within such changing circumstances, it is best understood as a process rather than as an object. And it is through such a process of elaboration of all the possible variants of a story that a myth responds to what Bloomberg calls the absolutism of reality. And so it's a response to the absolutism of reality that instead of calling for another form of absolutism, calls for the pluralistic nature of storytelling. Now, if we look at myth from this point of view, what happens when it comes to politics? A political myth is the work on a common narrative that grants significance to the political conditions and experiences of a social group. What makes a political myth out of a simple narrative is neither its claim to truth nor its content, as some people have argued. For instance, there's nothing political per se in stating that the world is about to disappear, but nevertheless, the narrative of the millennium, which is based on this idea, has worked as a political myth in certain circumstances. What makes a political myth out of a narrative is, first, the fact that it coagulates and reproduces significance, second, that a given group shares in it, and third, that it can address the political conditions in which a given group lives. A political myth must respond to a need for significance, otherwise it would be a mere narrative and must be shared because it must address the specific political condition of a social group. Otherwise said, to put it bluntly, is not only the result of a pre-existing identity, but also, and much more, the means for creating a collective identity. just a couple of consequences of this definition. First, to paraphrase Gramsci, political myths are not a piece of paper. The work of a political myth cannot be reduced to the stories that we read in our books. These are only some of the products of the work of myth. To establish whether a narrative is a political myth or not, we must look not only at its production, but also and foremost at its reception and at the whole process of production, reception, and reproduction. Second, political myths are not usually learned at once, but rather apprehended through some sort of cumulative exposure to this work. Significance allocates itself between what is consciously learned and what is unconsciously apprehended. And this also explains the condensational power of political myths, their capacity to contract into a few images, or what I would call icons. By means of a synecdoche, any object, painting, an image, a song, or even a gesture, can recall the whole work of myth that lies behind it. And this is also the reason why it's often difficult to analyze them. The work on a political myth takes place through icons that allusively refer to the given narrative, and most of the time is intermingled with other types of narrative. So we have religious myths, we have historical myths, we have scientific myths, and we must always disentangle the different elements within the narrative. Now, in sum, political myths are mapping devices, certainly not the only one, but let's say are among the mapping devices that help us to look at the world, feel something about it, and therefore also act within it as a social group. As such, they cannot be falsified because, as Sorel put it, they're not scientific hypotheses or, as he say, astrological almanacs. The myth of the proletarian general strike does not foretell the future, it creates it. The practical dimension of political myth cannot, however, be separated from what we can call the cognitive and the aesthetic dimension. Political myths provide a cognitive schema for the mapping of the social world. By reducing the complexity of our experience, they enable us to come to terms with the multifaceted character of the world we live in. And on the basis of such mapping devices, we also act and feel about the world. And this, in turn, points to the aesthetic dimension, to the fact that political myths are narratives of events cast in a dramatic form. And it is from the articulation of such a drama that the specific pathos of a political myth stems. It should now be clear why I think that approaching myths from the point of view of their claim to truth is misleading. They are, in the first place, not scientific hypotheses about the world, but the expression of a determination to act within it that is potentially self-fulfilling. This, however, does not mean that we have no criteria according to which we should look at them. We can, and indeed we should, look at them as means for acting in the present. This practical assessment is particularly complex because most of the times no single identifiable myth maker can be identified. As processes, we have to look constantly as the whole process of production, reproduction, and reception, and the role that this work plays within a social group. To put it bluntly, as time is almost over, political myth can be the terrain of a radical imagination that advances a critique of the existing social order by disclosing alternative suite, but it can also be the means for closing up such a space by making people believe that things are in a certain way and cannot be otherwise. This, for instance, I think was the case of the Cassirer myth of the Aryan race, which could not really readapt to other circumstances, but had to be dismissed with the political regime that produced it, precisely because it was meant to operate a closure of the social imaginary rather than an opening. So, conclusions, just a few minutes. What I wanted to do in this very brief presentation was not so much telling you what is the right definition of political myth, but rather, most of all, I wanted to invite you, if necessary in the first place, to look at this specific place where myth operates. And accepting this invitation is especially important today, given all the talk that is going on about political theology as the only alternative to the iron cage of a rationalized and bureaucratized political world. Focusing on political myth is a way to show that between the shield of political theology and the charybdis of a rationalist iron cage, there is a third possibility, that of the pluralism of myth. It is not true that if God is dead, then our political world is meaningless. The world can be endowed with meaning and even with significance without calling in the monotheism of political theology. And not by chance, Carl Schmitt, the philosopher who brought the concept of political theology to the center of contemporary debate, was also the one who most emphatically dismissed myth. And why so? Because he saw in myth a dangerous source of pluralism. Now, perhaps theorists of political theology, in our department we have Simon Critchley, are right in saying that we need fictions to overcome political apathy. But not all fictions are religious fictions. Not all myths are religious myths. To paraphrase Hegel, conflating all that is not rational within the big pot of political theology means ending up in the night where all cows equally look black. Let us avoid this temptation and start distinguish between different cows. The cow of political myth is not the cow of political theology. Yet, it is a cow that I think I have shown, I hope at least I have shown, as something to offer to us in the left, a political world that is less indifferent, which perhaps is not much, but at the same time, it is not nothing. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Giovanna Boradori, and I have a question for Chiara. Thank you for the beautiful paper. I was wondering along the lines of your, according to which you described and distinguished myth, if it wasn't fair to say, you said at one point that myth is never really there because it needs this constant engagement of retelling in which you identify its fundamental pluralism as well. So myth needs an engagement with the future. Myth needs an engagement with a dimension that is of the not yet, of the unfinished. And that seems to me also to have kind of a spectral quality to it. Myth is always still to come, yet to come. The myth is interminable. And I was wondering how, if this is a fair definition, how that relates to your nephew, you know, and the story, the anecdote about his own association with a figure like Berlusconi, you know, provided that there is a connection between myth and Berlusconi, you know, this promise of the not yet.
I have a list of 7 people now.
Maybe I try to use this. Is that what you're okay? So just very briefly, I never really say that myth is never there, and certainly Berlusconi is there, and it's not. We're not getting rid of it, and it seems to have defied even death. Like he's there. What I was trying to say is that myth have, at least in through the genealogy that, you know, which I gave only final the end of it, so to speak, that I was trying to reconstruct it. It has a pluralism, right? It has a sort of pluralistic nature that allows for a plurality of stories to be there. Now, this is the core, I take, of myth understood as a process. And then, of course, if for every single context, you have to see what happens, right? There are contexts where there is an attempt to bring this plurality to an end, so to close it upon itself. And there are cases where this doesn't happen. Right? Now, in the case of Berlusconi, I think it's too early to say what is going to happen. He certainly came to power by playing a lot on the myth of the homo novus the self-made man. I made it here, you can make it too. And there are certainly, at least it seems to me, a lot of clones and variants of this myth which are ready to take its place. So I don't know what is going to happen. So I think it's too early to say whether we just need a new regime and this myth will go away. Unfortunately, I think it's too much tied with the idea of the end of politics, and that we no longer want professional politicians, but we want self-made men, those who come from nowhere, the way he presents himself.
Thank you.
About myth, I wonder if we can consider the presence of myth in terms of gradations. So there are full versions, long stories, there are short versions, and then there are shorthands, just not icons, just words: free market, democracy, consensus, consent, etc. And these shorthands usually, well, sometimes, often, stand for a story that someone can tell. Not me, but someone can tell this story. I don't have to believe in the story. This is one of the characteristics of myth. But it's a very useful story. And I can rely on it, not on it actually, because I cannot tell it, but on others who can do this for me.
Jay, and then maybe I'll just take Paul and Andreas and Barbara after that. Jay.
Great. Let me just follow on directly from Adi's before I ask questions to Paul. So my deep skepticism about political myth is it seems to get all its force from your duality between a rationalized state and theology on the other hand. That is, your notion of myth seems to me to be a defense of nihilism, rather than asking about a critique of the extravagancies of political theology and rationalized reason. So one of the ways in which my thought follows directly on Ramadi's is that the reason for nihilism is because we have not made compelling how a wholly secular form of life can be rationally compelling and effectively satisfying. And to get the right kind of story, we need the further kind of accounts like Bilal was beginning to build. So it seems to me everything you said undermines everything he said, and is deeply dangerous thereby.
I had a much gentler version of Jay's question for Chiara, it was about nihilism. It was about a nihilism question. So one of the peculiar responses to nihilism that Adorno has a lot to say about concerns Beckett, and Beckett's interest to Adorno is precisely his unassimilability to myth making and to myth. That there's no way to make a myth out of a Beckett play, not even a one-word myth like democracy or consent. Yeah, but not even Godot, because it doesn't call to mind a story. It doesn't call to mind anything that would give intelligibility, fate, meaning, significance, etc. to action. And Adorno thinks this is actually a good response, a useful response to nihilism. So this might be also something. Yeah.
So to begin with the last two questions, which I'll begin with the stronger version, or reply to the stronger version, which I think somehow also address the first one. First of all, I totally agree with you that a whole secular way of life is meaningful on itself and it can be defended on itself. But for me, your question precisely embodies what I see as the problem. Now, the two Sheila and Charybdis of rationalism and political theology is not a duality, in fact. I think that what is happening is that the critique of religion, in particular in the left, has all too often brought with it a more general critique of all form of enchantment, right, to use a general word, which is not doing us a good service. So what I was trying to do, and with the notion of myth, was precisely to point to all the different things, right? So we can have a whole secular way of life endowed with meaning without God. That's fine. Maybe for some people that's enough. Maybe for some other people they need something more. They need something that responds to a more like emotionally and deeply rooted need for significance. Maybe for them myth is something that can provide a further source of political motivation and action. So what I was trying to do was precisely to say, maybe if we begin with one of the two, either the Scylla or the Charybdis, we are meant to remain oscillating in this duality, which in fact doesn't exist, right? So indeed, I think what I was trying to do, to reply to your question, Adiofi, is really pointing to the graduations. There are different graduations. There are distinctions that needs to be made, and I think we have nothing to gain from not making distinctions, right? Maybe concepts are free-floating, but I don't think we gain anything if we put myth together with religion and symbols and everything under the heading of a mythical consciousness or disenchantment, and then we have no more distinctions. Then we are left between a false duality. But just one other thing, I'm trying to respond briefly. I would still want to keep the distinction between shorthands for a whole narrative that doesn't respond to a deep need for significance, right? So maybe a word that simply catches a whole narrative to which I don't feel like I'm part of, and an icon that is a shorthand which is endowed with an emotional grasp on myself that simply, potentially takes me to the street, right? It makes me act. This is what I try to say by saying that political myths are not simple narratives that leaves us indifferent, right? They contain somehow a determination to act. I hope I've replied to
one question or comment for both, for each. Chiara, what is your account about the sources of political myths? Who are the myth makers for you? Whose myths should we accept and follow? Because I'm afraid underneath your account there is the specter again of avant-gardism. That some produce myths and create our identities, motivate us to act. So who makes the myths? That's all.
Okay, Andreas, you asked me who are the myth makers. I have to say it's a bad question. It's the first time I have to tell you, because usually I have very interesting comment. It's a bad question in the sense that it doesn't make sense to ask it. Is Homer the one who
Homer is
made
no political
the
myth. You said
okay, wait.
So Ren says who makes the myths.
Let me get there. In the same way, so it doesn't. For me, it doesn't make sense to ask whether Homer made the myth of Ulysses. It was building on an oral tradition of stories that was already going on. Equally, when the example I made of Berlusconi, you cannot say that Berlusconi made the myth of the self-made man. This is a sort of narrative core that has been going and circulating quite for some time. Of course, he feed it on a particular narrative, on a particular variant of that story. But if what I was saying about the fact that we need to look at the whole process of production, reproduction, reception, reproduction, what I was trying to say with the sequence was that you can't really separate between them. The process of production for myth is one and the same with the process of its reception and its reproduction. So it's not a good question.
I don't think we could end on a better note than this, because it's just wonderful. It's just the total spirit of what we've been trying to do. I thank everybody absolutely for your contributions, and also for tolerating me being such a taskmaster throughout these 2 days. But this has been wonderful. We're going to reconvene at Columbia in March and keep moving on from there. So thank you all so much. And as Cam just reminded me, there's a new issue out of the journal, Political Concepts. It just came out 2 weeks ago. And another one that will be out in a month. That's online. So have a look.
To say, Socrates also had something to say. So both the Greeks and the Indians were silent. It needs to be said, but I don't think I would have managed it without misunderstanding the issues of justice.
Yes, I was just asking Mary why she wanted to say this. We know everybody. We know everybody. Just right there. You know, our new copy out before. Yeah.